It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I listen to stuff like that. I always tempted to take out my AARP membership card. You sort of wonder how the years creep up, and my sons can't even believe that 1968 is not history, something you study in college, but it's not current affairs. In any event, what I'll try to talk about tonight is to put some of these issues which I've gathered up under the rubric, the title American Theocracy, oil, radical religion, and debt. And as I'll get into, the notion of this and the importance of it is that if you look at the United States in the context of, not what we sort of think of ourselves as, but in the context of what's gone wrong with previous empires and leading world economic powers, you start to get a laundry list of things that have gone wrong in the past that were bad symptoms. And we have most of them. And when I talk about radical religion, oil, and debt, somebody will say, well, what about terrorism? What about global anarchy? What about Iraq? And I guess what I would say is that the two subjects of radical religion and oil pretty much cover most of what comes under the symbol of Iraq, let's say, or terrorism, or the mess in the world geostrategically. Because religion has an awful lot to do with it, the radicalism of religion, not just Islam, but Christianity as well, and others. And then oil, the whole basis of what the Middle East has been about in the last century of history has been oil. Somebody will say, but aren't we there protecting democracy? Well, you can look at the history books all you want, and you don't find that the great powers went to the Middle East to protect democracy. The maps are all written around oil. If you look at a map of the Middle East in World War I, what's there? Oil. If you look at the map of the Middle East, the Persian Gulf in the 1930s, do they draw all the boundaries of the territories? No, of the oil fields and who had which concession. And even if you jump up just to, say, 2001, Dick Cheney's task force on energy, what were they looking at? Maps of where the oil fields were in Iraq, and which ones were going to go to the Russians and the Chinese and the French if Saddam Hussein was allowed to stay in power and the sanctions came off. That's how they were going to solve the energy crisis. So a lot of the Middle East is oil and religion, and in no sense when I talk about radical religion, oil, and borrowed money, am I leaving out these cross currents of geopolitics and terrorism and war in the Middle East. Far from it. Now let me start tonight not looking at the symbols of what's going wrong and how they raise these flags, but let me start out with the question of this midterm election year. And I've been asking some people from both the university and from the community, is there a sense of, I guess on campus, excitement about this election? The answer I get is, well, it's kind of hard to tell. And I guess what that means is, what's there to be excited about American politics? I sort of sympathize with that. But there is something afoot this year, and you sort of have to wonder whether it isn't going to be significant. Now, because we're wondering whether it's going to be significant, and we have good reason to, you have to keep in mind that these sorts of trends, it looks like something big might be about to happen, it could also easily turn out on election day that if the Democrats gain, say 12 or 13 seats in the House of Representatives and 3 in the Senate, that will be a major shortfall. Historically speaking, that would be weakness in these what they call 6-year-itch elections, and you could see a whole reversal of the interpretation. Well, let me give you a little bit of a background on this. I think that the American people are actually ahead of the opinion molders and the media and a lot of the experts. They've been very skeptical of George W. Bush over the last 3 years at important intervals. I've had books that have come out that have put me in the position of arguing that, the administration is screwing up, or the Bushes have done this or that in the course of their quarter century of power. And George W., back in 2004 in the spring when American Dynasty came out, his job numbers got down into 36, 38%, even though as people got to see John Kerry and the Democratic candidates' skills and personality became the issue, that took some of the pressure off Bush, and his numbers crept up into the 40s. Then again, earlier this year, when American Theocracy came out, which got up to number 2 on the New York Times list, and there were other books coming out too, and there was one Harris poll back in April that showed George W. going down to 29% job approval. Now, most of them showed in the low 30s. And then he climbs back up again in late summer, largely because of the terrorism issue, and then in the last 3 weeks or so, it's back down into the mid-30s. And I think this is a very important breaking trend roused around Hastert, Foley, the mess in Iraq, the intelligence estimates, Bob Woodward's book. There really is this sense that even if the Democrats don't have a whole lot to say that's got any depth, the Republicans are a disaster. Now, as someone who spent a lot of time on the Republican electoral coalition, and that's part of what I think represents the weaknesses that the country has in religion, debt, and oil, partly because they all have elements of their primacy in the Republican coalition. This is an election that could be enormously significant. Most of you would think if the Democrats took both houses of Congress after 12 years of the Republicans, that would be a huge development. And they can do this by winning 16 or 17 seats in the House and 6 in the Senate. Now, when you get your big upheavals in Congress in the United States, it's generally what people call the 6-year-itch elections. That's when you've got a 2-term president, and it's the middle of his 2nd term, and people are getting tired of him, and they want to change. And these elections, whether it was in 1966 or 1974 or 1986, have produced some of the big upheavals. So it's actually historically not very much if the Democrats win 22 House seats in one of these 6-year-itch elections. And 6 Senate seats would be good, but it's not extraordinary. So even if they hit exactly where it'll be celebrated on the front pages as a huge victory, it's not that big historically. It's not to say it isn't enormously meaningful this time, it would be. But I go through this backdrop to say, now suppose turnout is a little different than people think. Suppose for some reason the Republicans get excited and they turn out, and the Democratic turnout isn't as much. And as a result, the Democrats wind up winning 12 or 13 House seats and 3 in the Senate. My suggestion is that this would not only be seen as a shortfall from where the psychology is today, but it would give a whole lot of marginal Republicans who right now have the sense that the guillotine is hanging over the back of their neck and they can feel the tickle of the steel, to think, hey, it wasn't there. It wasn't there. And as you've got right now, politics in this country poised and ready to move more in a center-left direction. If what people are thinking happens, it could go the other way. And the numbers wouldn't be horrible for the Democrats, but they would be a huge letdown. So with this as a backdrop, let me now go to the question of these issues and what they represent in American politics, and frankly, how, in my opinion, unnerving they are. Now, as was mentioned here, and I'm certainly not going to try to go through a whole laundry list, but a number of the books that I've written in the last 25 years have moved away from straight politics to a kind of political economics, of looking at what's been happening to the U.S. economy in the sense of what happened to the previous leading world economic powers. And I worried, for example, about it being a bad sign that industry and commerce would fade in favor of finance. Historically, that was not good. It's happened before. It's a bad signal. But as I got into this, and I wrote more about economics than other things back in the 1980s and less since then. But it started to become clear that if you looked at these empires, these leading world economic powers, and it's mostly the usual laundry list: the British, the Dutch when they were the leading world commercial empire, when New York was New Amsterdam in the 17th century. Before that, Habsburg Spain, which was half of Western Europe, and before that, Rome. And what they shared was a fascinating list. And as I've written these books, slowly but surely, I keep buying the books about the different countries, and my wife says, "You're crazy, you're not going to read that thing." You know. Well, I do. It doesn't improve her opinion of me any that I do, but it's a fascinating backdrop, because as you have all these resources, you can look and say, yes, these are the things that have emerged that have become problems for all of these empires, these leading world economic powers. Now, here's really what's involved, and let me just go through them quickly. I'll come back with a little bit more depth, but for people who are really interested, I'll be glad to pick up with a lot more, if you like, in the questions. These were the half dozen things that after 25 years of looking at this, I've seen as the trouble symbols in the leading world economic powers. The first is a sense that people in these countries have of the nation having forms of decay. Now, the decay can be economic. It's losing jobs, losing industry, losing fishing, losing shipping, losing commerce, all these things, and it tends to move in the direction of stuff that's less real, that's more on paper. The other kind of decay is moral. People have the sense that we don't have the fortitude that our ancestors had, and they look back on the days of patriotic achievement and revolutions that were the famous revolutions, whether it was, for Spain taking back the peninsula from the Moors, from the Arabs, for the Dutch getting their independence, for the British becoming an empire. And they have all the glorious history, and as they start getting the sense that things aren't going that well anymore, there's a sense of moral decay, that people aren't as tough anymore. And they tend to be unhappy with what they see in theaters and literature, and you tend to get, and this is again a pattern, you get issues of the questions of homosexuality coming to the fore and becoming political issues. And in no sense is the United States unique that way. It's not a central phenomenon, but it's out there as a collateral. And there's this sense of decay that conservatives talk about as moral and religious and spiritual, and liberals talk more about in terms of economics and fairness. And these things tend to be growing during these periods of sort of the end of the peak, when people are getting the sense that, we are starting to decay. And we've certainly seen that in the United States in recent years, the sense of that problem. There's also a very real pattern in these countries that partly in response to this, there tends to be more religion. Now, more religion is an easy description, but what you get is more evangelicalism, more crusading religion, more sort of moral imperialism, more proselytizing, more sending missionaries, more of a sense of, I hate to use the word again, crusading in some form or other. And whether it was Spain with the Inquisition and wanting to spread Catholicism all over, or the British and the white man's burden and the whole sense of moral empire. If you want to read about how the British preened as much as how they brought democracy and representative government to the world, and the white man's burden, and they were there to uplift people, and et cetera, et cetera. It's exactly where the United States gets it. It sounds in many ways like a replay of this kind of moral imperialism of the British, which had a major religious overtone. Now, another side that's tricky in terms of religion is during these periods of countries, again, sort of at the top of their game and then going over the hill and starting to turn down, you tend to get religion at odds with science. And as faith grows, more of the people that believe in religion and faith and believe less in rationalism will start to oppose the giving way of faith to science. And when Britain was in its moral imperialistic mode, that was the first round of Darwinian controversy over evolution. And of course, we have that right now, although it seems to be taking its licks. But you have right now the loggerheads between religion being at loggerheads with rationality and science, and issues from evolution to when does life begin and end, and forms of drugs, and questions of behavioral traits and what they represent. Do they represent sin? Do they represent something else? Are they biological? All of this reflects patterns that have seen before, and there isn't the time to go through and talk about the Inquisition and science and the problems the British had with the fight between faith and science too, but it's symptomatic in the United States that we're repeating that pattern as well. Now, another aspect of a kind of moral imperialism is that it goes hand in hand with a sense of a larger imperialism, an imperial duty and imperial opportunity and imperial burden in the military sense and the diplomatic sense. In the United States, you've all seen it in the last 5 or 6 years, the whole question of empire has moved to center stage. Now, it's certainly on center stage back in 2002 and 2003. Well, the old empire isn't doing so well right now, so you're not seeing so many banners of empire around. You know, the King of England for a fair period of time in the late 19th century and 20th century was called the King Emperor. And we haven't seen George W. Bush decide he's going to be the president and emperor or something. It's kind of hard when you got a 34% job approval. It is a psychology that we saw a lot of, the sense of America as empire. It's tattering now, but the extent to which the United States is committed to a global presence and trying to bring things under control in Afghanistan that we thought would be brought under control, now that's coming unraveled. Iraq is a disaster, and there was no excuse for not knowing that this was another Yugoslavia or another Czechoslovakia. You remember Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia? They were countries that had too many ethnic groups, and they ain't countries anymore. And that's the whole point. And Iraq was created at about the same time, and as I understand it from one of the recent books, this certainly strikes me as true, George W., a couple of weeks before we invaded Iraq, was still being instructed on the fact that the Sunnis and the Shiites don't like each other. He has a deep historical background. But it's really very significant because the extent to which we've rolled into these patterns and the military overreach of the previous leading world economic powers of the empires has been just relentless. What did in the British 2 world wars they couldn't afford? What did in the Spanish, essentially the 30 Years' War and trying to take over too much of the world? The Dutch couldn't handle a big empire, and they got strung out between 1689 and 1713 in 2 wars. The history is just relentless. So if you want to come up with a blueprint for the United States, what could we really do to screw it up? We could overreach in the Middle East. We could think we were going to bring democracy to Afghanistan and Iraq. That's what we could do. And we could have a whole sense of being the new empire, and we could have all these geopolitical dim bulbs that are, some of them are neoconservatives and some of them are other things. But remember all these articles that used to come out 2 and 3 years ago, and some still do, but about how we have to build this grand new force of mercenaries, we have to do this, that, and everything, and it's not a problem because remember Bush in his first year, they had the budget surplus. They were projecting, through a 2-term administration, but it disappeared. And of course, that brings me to another one of the parallels. What happened to these previous empires and leading world economic powers? They started to build up huge amounts of debt because they wanted to keep all the glories and the grandeur going. They wanted to have the armies everywhere. They wanted to have the reach of national power supporting their shipping, their insurance, their banking, whatever. And they couldn't afford it. So the debt keeps building up. The Spanish were incredible. They were just reckless beyond belief. The British were not reckless before World War I, but two wars just smashed their overseas economic circumstances. The pound sterling fell out of bed after World War II. All of these examples are very clear in the history books. Now, the other thing the United States has, now that the other countries didn't have, we not only have a large domestic, a government public debt, national debt, but it's not outrageous by itself. But we have the largest global debt by far in the world. We now have $4 trillion worth of international debt. We borrow another 500, 600, 700, 800 billion dollars every year to pay for the manufactured goods we no longer manufacture and the oil we can't get domestically. So we just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. And this puts a strain on your currency, but there's also the enormous amount of private debt that's been taken on, and this has set all kinds of records. It's what they call the total credit market debt in the United States is now 3.5 times GDP. You know, we've borrowed everything imaginable. And people say, well, it's not a problem because the assets have gone up more than the debt. Yeah, well, that's true as long as the assets keep going up. But suppose you have housing losing 25% of its value and the stock market over the next 2 years losing 35% of its value. Is your asset pool going to be larger than your debt? I'm afraid not. So you've got all these things out there that are really bad things historically. And part of the problem I saw with this was that the Republican Party and its coalition was to some extent the engine and the conveyor belt here. Now, long ago, I did the book that was mentioned called The Emerging Republican Majority, which basically laid out the Republican coalition. And it's come out pretty much as it said it would. It would be based in the South and the farm states and the Rocky Mountains in the West, and the Middle West would be the border, and New England and the Northeast would be the most liberal area along with the Pacific Coast, and that's roughly what's happened. But in the course of the almost 40 years now that this Republican coalition has been growing and increasing its dominance, it's gotten more and more weighted by the South, which has meant a major change in the religious concentration in the Republican Party, and by the energy states, be they coal or gas or oil, which previously were divided across the Mason-Dixon line, but not anymore. And your wealthy people, and to a considerable extent the financial sector in the United States, and the huge debt sector, which is mostly private, are also very important and fed more by the Republicans and by the Democrats, although a lot of the Democrats would like to become the new shepherds of that group of non-sheep too. So the Republican coalition is in many ways a vehicle of this, whether it be to be involved in wars in the Middle East, to be worried about all kinds of religious issues, whether it's connecting or not, or disconnecting Shivo in Florida, or abortion or stem cell research or whatever. And of course the question of energy, and the lack of any real desire to cut back on cars or to stress out the outer suburbs where too much money is spent on gas because the cars are too big and we can't afford it. We have to borrow money relentlessly every year that we can't afford. But you're not going to deal with this through the Republican coalition. Now, I hasten to add quickly, you're really not going to deal with it through the Democratic coalition either, because half the time it's been afraid of its shadow. And they're really not willing to tangle with the Republicans, and they also don't have the highest level understanding of the dynamics of national politics. I told a bunch of the Democrats several times in Washington in the last couple of years that part of the problem that you have is that you don't have an instinct for the jugular, you have an instinct for the capillaries. Whenever it's possible to trivialize an issue so that it's meaningless, boy, they're right out there. You know, some exciting thing about, you know, you're going to jeopardize a rare fern someplace becomes the big issue, and other things. I mean, if I show some vestigial republicanism here, you know, excuse me. But I'm serious. They don't have a sense of the jugular. And that's why what happened this year with that whole Foley, Hastert, the incredible mess in Iraq, the intelligence estimate, Bob Woodward's book, it finally reached the point where Democrats don't have to be intelligent to deal with it. They just have to be not the Republicans. You know, this is the key to American politics. You have to be not the people who are there, because if you have to be yourself, that's never going to cut it. But as long as you've got these cretins who've been in there too long screwing up. I can remember back in the late 1960s when the Republicans were playing this role, you know, basically too dumb to find the men's room without a map. Finally, it became so obvious with the cities falling apart in Vietnam and inflation beginning that they got elected because people were sick of the Democrats. And I think that could be a very strong thing this year. But one of the things to watch out for is this whole set of problems shows no sign of being dealt with and grappled with by either one of the parties. The Republicans, I understand why. The Democrats, because they're not sure what to say. They don't want to be controversial. They don't want to raise religious issues because somebody would find out they only go to church or synagogue 3 times a year, you know. So better leave it alone. Just not an aggressive set of tough dealing with the issues. Now, let me go quickly before I turn back and move into the 2008 and go away from my yardstick issues. Let me talk specifically about radical religion in the United States, because this is the one that I would single out, partly because the politicians and the media are so reluctant to deal with it in any serious way, partly because we have this thing about how you have to be nice, you can't talk about other people's religion even if it's kind of wacko, you don't really want to get into all that. You know, it's okay, they want to worship goldfish in the morning or something, that's all right, you know. So we don't do it. But basically what you've had is this extraordinary trend over the last 30 or 40 years. And I can't fault people for not having glommed onto it, because in the 1980s, when I was doing mostly things having to do with economic issues, I wasn't paying enough attention to the religious issues. I wasn't following all the things that George W. was doing as his father's liaison to the religious right, for example, in 1988. And when you weren't following all this, you didn't see very important things. And only by the 1990s was I starting to really heavily refocus on that. Now, let me tell you, and this is hindsight, because of what I can see now, the Southern strategy in the Republican Party, by pulling the South into the Republican orbit, basically took a pattern in which the religious people in the United States were divided between the parties. Most of the religious Protestants in the North who were white were Republican, but you had the ethnic Catholics in the North were Democrats, and the white Baptists and Pentecostals and evangelicals in the South, huge number, that's the big concentration, were Democrats. It was divided. But slowly but surely, what the Southern strategy did was not simply to take the religious people in the South and put them in the Republican Party, but because of the emphasis on religious and moral issues and conservative social stances and abortion and such like, you moved an awful lot of the ethnic Northern Catholics too. And the upshot was, by the 1990s, you could see that slowly but surely an increasing percentage of the Republican electorate was high church attending. And relatively few of the Democrats were high church attending, save for blacks. And you could see this division between the parties that really wasn't there before. Previously, you'd have very religious people on both sides, Catholics more Democratic, Protestants more Republican because of the North, but still sharply divided. Not by the 1990s. It was very striking that the people who went to church frequently were, by that point, 12, 13% more Republican than the country. And seculars were strongly Democrat. Now, as part of this, what you started getting was not simply that the Republicans had the great percentage of the religious people, but that the Republicans had the people who believed that government and religion should cohabit, that basically government and religion should work together, that they should be involved together. For example, 55% of white evangelicals, fundamentalists, and Pentecostals believe that religion should be a major priority of foreign policy. And you get, with a new grouping in the Republican Party, back in 2000 at the Millennium, Newsweek ran a poll that found 45% of American Christians saying that they believed in Armageddon in the end times. Now, out of this, only 18% of Catholics did, only 25% of mainline Protestants, but in the 70-odd% of fundamentalists and evangelicals and Pentecostals. So my computations were based on the fact that the Republican coalition is now so heavily tilted towards Bible-believing and the more radical Protestant, more religiously radical Protestants, which is so much of American history anyway, that it seemed to me that adding it up, probably 50 to 60% of the people who voted for Bush in 2004 would have answered the Newsweek poll saying that they believed in Armageddon in the end times. Now, I'll come back to this again in a couple of minutes because I think it has a very strong relationship to administration policy in the Middle East. But of course, as I mentioned, in terms of the science versus faith problem, that's now front and center. And the Bush people have appointed a number of people to public positions who take a very biblical or faith-based view of public policy. And I wouldn't mock it at certain levels, but, you know, for example, in Kentucky, the Bush people appointed a professor of obstetrics who was also a part-time faith healer to the Food and Drug Advisory Commission, the Food and Drug for the Drug Advisory Commission of the Food and Drug Administration. And lots of other people who are believers in abstinence, and of course they don't want to deal with stem cell research. And when you really go through and add it up, and I've got a couple of chapters in the book that try to do that, although it's certainly not the compendium that some other books have moved towards in that same dimension. But the administration is really very responsive to these people. And the notion that they're not is silly. They just don't want to talk about it. Right when my book came out back in March, George W. had a press conference in Ohio at the City Club of Cleveland, and he was asked by a woman there, did he agree with my point in American Theocracy that the administration was reaching out to the people who believed in Armageddon in the end times in the Middle East? Well, he starts out by saying, oh, I'm a practical kind of guy, and then he wanders for 4.5 minutes without even answering the question, without even mentioning the words. Now, they clearly don't like to talk about it, but my guess is that so many of their people do believe in it that he doesn't want to answer the question. They would, lose heavily in this audience if he said, oh, yes, I believe in it. You know, Armageddon is 3.5 years away and the Antichrist is already holed up in Iraq. You know, boom goes the vote in Santa Barbara County. Well, on the other hand, suppose he says, no, I don't believe in any of that. That's a bunch of garbage for all these people in the mountains, that have rattlesnakes in their church service. And boom goes Alabama. So he's between a rock and a hard place on this stuff. And the media are just not getting into it much at all, but it's a very central set of issues. Now, to show the way in which defining theocracy, one of the most important yardsticks it's a secondary yardstick, but it's a very important one. Theocracy is a country in which is ruled by rulers who the people think speak for God, or rulers who themselves think they speak for God. So I have over the years kept this sort of little compendium of Bush speaks for God and God told him to do this and that. And it's something that, it gets mentioned from time to time. In 1999, when he was campaigning, he spoke to a group of preachers and said he thought God wanted him to be president. Then other reports like this were commonplace during 2002, but after 9/11, he was happy to have it because he was sure this was a winning set of issues for him. And the Washington Post, after 9/11, Pat Robertson had resigned as the head of the Christian Coalition. And the Washington Post surveyed a group of the religious right leaders in Washington and Virginia, where a lot of them are based, and asked them who was going to replace Pat Robertson as the leader of the religious right. And they said, oh, you know, there wasn't any question. George Bush was the leader of the religious right in the nation, that God knew that he was the leader we had to have and would need with 9/11. And this whole article just went into all of this. So here he was sitting in the White House with an 80% job approval, also bathing in the fact that the people in his constituency, the leaders, were saying he spoke for God. God knew he was the man. In June 2003, according to a BBC broadcast that aired for the first time in October 2005, George W. was at a summit meeting with the Palestinian leadership. I realize that's sort of a difficult concept, to go to a summit with those people, but they were there. They had a prime minister and a foreign minister, and according to what they said on camera for the BBC, Bush said to them, God told me to invade Afghanistan, and I did. God told me to liberate Iraq, and I did. And God is telling me to bring peace in the Middle East, and I will. That's a very good paraphrase. It's not the exact words, but you can get it online. BBC, October 2005, but done back in June 2003. In July 2004, he was in Pennsylvania, which has its own Bible Belt, and he was in Lancaster County, and the Lancaster New Era reported this. George W. went to a meeting with a couple of hundred old order Amish, and they went into a barn, and the press weren't permitted in there. And after they came out of the barn with George W., the press asked the Amish, what did he say? And they quoted him as saying, and this ran in the Lancaster New Era, and it's on the internet too, I trust God speaks through me. Without that, I couldn't do my job. Now, they've never denied this one. They sort of denied the BBC thing. They had to, but they've never denied this. This, to me, is where I think the theocracy aspect becomes the most worrisome. Was this guiding them for a couple of years after 9/11? I think so. I think it pushed them in ways that made them much more amenable to the various Shivo business, in the sense that a lot of the Armageddon people have, that the next great battleground is in Iraq, and that they thought Saddam was probably the Antichrist. And some of you, probably not very many, but a few of you may have tried the first volume of the Left Behind series. This is kind of unbelievable, but it involves Iraq as the headquarters of the Antichrist, and he has a French advisor, and he came up through the UN. I mean, you sort of want the strategy of how we went into Iraq. It was thumb in the eye of France and dump the United Nations and let's head for Iraq and get the Antichrist, you know. And it isn't funny. It isn't funny. And there was that, I can't remember his name, Lieutenant General somebody, who was the one that went around to all the churches and, you know, said God is with us and so forth. I think this was very serious. Well, let me move away from this, because I think it's going to get whipped in this election. And I don't think that there's any danger that this is going to be a triumph for the religious right. They're losing in Ohio, they're losing in Pennsylvania, they'll probably lose their abortion initiative in South Dakota, they're probably going to lose stem cell research in Missouri. There's starting to be polls that show in Bellwether, Ohio, for example, that the Republican candidates are running 20 points behind Bush's showing among the evangelicals. I mean, that's a real loss. I think some of the sense of the hypocrisy here and some of the oddity of his speaking that he thinks for God maybe is part of it. The mess in Iraq is obviously another part of it. If he's fulfilling God's blueprint in Iraq, then obviously he needs a new pair of glasses, because God's blueprint isn't doing too well, or George Bush wouldn't know God's blueprint from a speeding ticket. I can entertain that too. Now, where are we for 2008? I wish I could be optimistic about 2008, but I think the odds are pretty good that we're going to see the Democrats sort of having dynasty envy of the Republicans. Are going to decide, well, if you could have the son of the previous Republican president, we can nominate the wife of the previous Democratic president. And that'll be a very Democratic and very American talent pool that they're dealing in. I like Hillary personally, but I just don't see this pattern. I think when you're dealing with entrenched interests in the two parties, they cannot rise to the occasion of tackling things that have to be tackled. I think we need to have more people who are insurgents in thought process. Although what happened with Ned Lamont in my own state in Connecticut, as soon as he won the nomination, he was sort of smothered in Democratic bland centrism and really had nothing to say again. And Arianna Huffington wrote an extraordinarily funny draft concession speech for Ned Lamont to give if Joe Lieberman wins. And it basically consists of all of Arianna's analysis of how Ned Lamont could say, I shouldn't have sounded like all those turkeys. I should have, tried to say something original like I did before, and I'm disgusted with myself and all of this. And Arianna has occasional use for four-letter words, so they were in there too. I thought it was very much to the point. I think Lamont isn't going to win. So I just have this feeling that whatever we get out of the 2008 election isn't going to be up to dealing with the problem. Now, I don't have a sense that I can say what the problem is in 2008. It's a wide open election. There's no president, no vice president to be a nominee for the first time since 1952. It's very hard to know whether we're going to be at war. It's hard to know what the economy is going to like. It's hard to know whether, I don't think we'll have another Bush, but occasionally they mention Jeb. It's just awfully hard to see where that dynamic is going to be coming from. And I had two elections I felt that way about. One was 1968, where I knew the publisher was right. We couldn't publish the emerging Republican majority before the election. That was a place where that year was just all over the map. And then 1992, I had a book that was supposed to come out in 92, but we were so thrown off by the Gulf War that it went over early 93, and it sure as hell should have come out in 92, but it wasn't ready. Sometimes you get the sort of election you don't want to throw a book into, and I can only give you my personal yardstick. I don't want to throw a book into the 2008 election. I don't have any sense of what's going to be out there, and I think anybody who has a sense that it's really wide open in a lot of ways is quite right. And I wish I could be much more optimistic than I am about where it's all going to go. But since most of you out here, not all, but many are a lot younger than I am, you have the great advantage that youth is more optimistic and that you don't have to take that view. My sons who get to hear this sort of stuff all the time just, sort of tune it out. It's Dad. You don't have to worry about that stuff, or if you do, somehow it's not going to happen to them because they're 30 and they're invulnerable, So I don't want to end on the note of all sorts of gloom and doom. So let's hope we have a very interesting, fascinating election that launches a lot of very interesting people into political careers who thrive in that hothouse of intellectual development, Washington, D.C., and who lead the nation on to glorious new horizons. Thank you.
First off, thank you very much for the book. I have to say I had the opportunity to read it right after reading The Rubicon by Ted Holland, so they were a terrific pairing. Mike, I'd like to ask one question two different ways. It's recently been reported, I want to talk to your third section in the book, it's recently been reported by the administration that in fact the deficit has gone down. I'd be curious as to your comments, given the irony as to where those tax receipts have come from due to AMT. And as a corollary to that, I thought maybe you could comment real quickly in regards to, it's now documented that China now has over $1 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. And so my first question, at what point do they say enough? And thank you again.
Well, let me try to take, first of all, there are a number of types of deficits. I mean, one deficit, quite obviously, is the federal budget deficit each year. and it's going to be about 250, 260 billion in this fiscal year. But if you throw in the Social Security gimmick, you have to kick it up another 120. But that's not too bad historically. It's only 2.5% of GDP. What they don't want to discuss is what they call the current account deficit. Now, the current account deficit is the broadest reflection of how much more money we have to borrow, essentially, the outflow in terms of net indebtedness each year, globally. And the current account deficit in the United States is up to like $775 billion a year. And the size of the total credit market debt in the United States, the major problem is not right at the moment in the national debt per se, it's in all the contingent liabilities in the entitlement sector that don't go into the budget deficit count or the calculations for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years that basically have Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security running amok. And they know that, of course, and they know the extent to which we've become a global borrower to an unbelievable degree. The countries that are pulling together the largest exchequers, so to speak, the largest treasure chests, are first off the manufacturing countries, principally Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, especially China. Those are the big ones. And the Chinese, I gather, are supposed to be going above $1 trillion of dollar assets this year. Now, what are they going to do with them? They've earned them in order to keep the Chinese currency from gaining strength that would make it harder to sell Chinese goods in the United States. But the great caution in terms of all these dollars that are building up around the world is that so many people have them, not just the manufacturing countries, but the oil countries. The Russians are pulling together a huge treasure chest. They're the biggest oil exporter, edging ahead of the Saudis a number of months of the year. So this money out there is sitting in the hands of people who, well, they know they've got a reason to buy it, but if it's going to start imploding, do you want to be the first people to sell or the 14th? Because the first people will only lose about 4 or 6% of your asset value, but the 14th is probably going to lose 30% of the asset value in the 2 or 3 weeks it might take if you had people dumping. And the other thing, they don't have to sell, they can just stop buying. And if they stop buying, then the cost of the United States borrowing will climb rapidly, and of course that'll push up other portions of the debt structure. So all of this is a set of hurdles that are high, and nobody knows how high we can continue to leap relative to how strong the economy is going to be. If you have a situation where, and California is obviously one of the 4 or 5 states that'll show this the most if it happens. If housing starts to implode, then you don't want to raise interest rates, because if you raise interest rates to fight inflation, then the housing bubble is going to pop even more loudly. Well, if you have to reduce interest rates to keep the housing bubble from popping, then you basically reduce the amount that people make on their dollar investments, which could lead them to sell a dollar. And if you want to stop them from selling the dollar, then you raise interest rates and you make a bigger mess out of the housing bubble. So there are people that take a very, damned if you do and damned if you don't view of this. And I have to say that we assumed a lot of this would happen already, that it should be happening now. But a lot of people assumed that the tech bubble had to burst in 1999, and it just stopped and stopped and stopped, and finally was so big when it had to burst that it was 5,100 when it popped, and it's only, 2,300, 2,250 now, so it's never gone back anywhere near that. We don't know what's going to happen with all of this stuff, and all the questions the questioner asked are perfectly valid. The only reason we can say this may be harmless is because it hasn't popped yet. Maybe it's harmless because it hasn't popped yet. I certainly hope so, Personally, I mean, I've got a couple of houses. I'd like them to retain their present value. It'd be very nice. I'd enjoy it.
In your book, you predicted that the slumping house prices would have a dramatic effect on the economy as a whole. And now that I've been looking at some headlines and it seems like it's going in that direction, what I want to know is how far do you think it's going to slide and what's going to happen to the people with maxed out credit cards and their fancy adjustable mortgage rates?
Well, the adjustable mortgage rates are a problem that they anticipate, and this isn't my field to know exactly what happens when, but the prognosis is that you get your major developments there in 2007. Now, in terms of the overbuilding in places, one of the most obvious effects, and I think it's bound to be starting, it is starting in some places and it should accelerate, is as people can't sell homes that are sitting there in lots, and that's certainly happening in a number of places. You're going to see layoffs by home builders, layoffs by construction teams, layoffs by real estate agents. And the reason this is significant is by some analyses, and I credit this, although it's not a field that I would say, I could do the analyses myself, because I couldn't. They guesstimate that something between 60 and 70% of the jobs added in the last 3 years in the economy have been housing and construction related. So if this bubble pops, you have a much greater vulnerability in that profile of where we added jobs than you've ever had before. At the same time as the oil vulnerability is probably less because there are fewer people in the oil business. But housing has this huge employment kicker from the last couple of years, last 4 or 5 years, which makes that a huge X factor. And I would still bet that it's a bubble and it's going to cause major problems.
Okay, we can only take like the 3 questions that we have represented in you. So you're next.
Thank you. You've drawn comparisons between the decline of the empires of the past, the United States. What affinity do you see between the 9/11 attacks and the trouble symbols of these previous empires?
Well, the empire and its problems that I know best, obviously the most recent one, the British. And I can't think of any parallel to 9/11, although World War II was shattering for them because they knew that even before that was over, they'd had to sell all their overseas assets and they were just going to have to be supported by the United States currency-wise. And for a long time, not for a long time, but for several months in 1940, portions of American opinion thought that Britain couldn't hold out. So that was obviously a very traumatic war for them. World War I was too, but it was different. 9/11 to me is in some ways really exaggerated as a phenomenon, but because they struck where they did and we saw it the way we did, and you did have 3,000 people killed, it's impossible to avoid its massive symbolism. But there's an Ohio State professor who's just published a book sort of on the comparative statistics of terror versus how many people have died from other things in the United States. And he has a very real point. And he said that by psyching ourselves into this fascination with terror, we're crippling ourselves. And I think that's true. The countries that have had a longer experience with war and terror-linked war, which is to say Europe, and for that matter Asia too, dealing with the Japanese and plenty of other things recently, they don't take it quite as seriously. It's not the wrench. And I think we have been psyched into taking this more seriously in some ways than we should if you do a cold, stone, sober analysis of how people die. And I mean, even in the United States in previous eras, there's been terrorism. Anybody who lived along the frontier in any period where there was an Indian war had pretty substantial terrorism. But we have, and I think, again, it's partly because of the administration and their desire to maximize this. But let me throw one ingredient in, and I don't want to talk too long here. This whole question of Armageddon and the end times, the people who believe in this don't see terror standing alone. They see it as part of this biblical event. They see it as the fulfillment of portions of the book of Revelations. And if you read the Left Behind series, this whole climate is something that has a very strong religious overtone, and of course they're writing from the standpoint of the believers. And for those who do believe in this, and there's a pretty considerable number in the United States, that gives terror a constituency of a sort that doesn't think of it as terror, if I'm making the point there, that thinks of it as having a larger religious dimension. And I think that's one of the reasons why the terror debate has been so big here with such an underpinning, because for a lot of people it has a prop that comes in the religious dimension.
I loved your comments about Democrats having an instinct for going for the capillaries. And it caused me to reflect on the problem that's been bothering me, and I'm sure a lot of people in the American public, in terms of what's happened to the quality of leadership in this country. In the Democratic Party, in part, but we can also see it's a major crisis facing the Republican Party. How do we explain that? Is it perception of the way leadership is portrayed in the media, or is there reality a fault in the political process? Is it the campaign funding issues and the too many hands in the pockets of K Street? Or is it the 9/11 impact and somehow causing people to sort of not speak up and take a visibly different position?
I think it's much more than 9/11. 9/11 aggravated it in some ways, but one of the things when I look back at these previous countries and empires, as you got into the stage that we're in now, it became pretty clear that it was very hard for these countries to draw on a major talent pool. The countries would be polarized, they'd be divided by old issues that probably shouldn't matter but did, old divisions. Interest groups would be incredibly entrenched after this peak period of the country having been in the global commercial and military and financial sun, whether it was Spain or the Dutch or the British. I think that's where we are now. And one of the most revealing things, I had to give a talk over in London at something in 1988, because I remember it was Dole versus Bush in the Republican primaries, and the Democrat who was pulling ahead and got the nomination was Dukakis, and this wasn't overwhelming the British. And I said, well, I understand. I don't think this is exactly the greatest talent pool the United States has ever fielded, but on the other hand, if you go back and you look at the people that the British elected as prime minister, or elected parliaments who elected them as prime minister, during the period before the end of the Lloyd George coalition after World War I, and Winston Churchill taking office in 1940, Britain had 4 prime ministers, and usually nobody in the audience can name all 4. So I said, anybody here name all 4? And nobody said a word. Maybe they could have, maybe they couldn't have. But the point was that almost nobody remembered one of them, and 3 of the others had just proven mediocrities, and they took the point immediately. There was no way the British system in the 20s and 30s could mobilize itself to do other than talk about these things and wring their hands that they couldn't afford this, or they couldn't build that, or they couldn't dare go to war in 1938 because they hadn't rebuilt the Air Force yet, and all this sort of stuff. And if you go back and you look at these countries during these periods, they have an awful lot of trouble getting really top-flight people who can raise the issues. And it sort of makes me take almost a somewhat determinist view of it, that you create the interest group infrastructure that then guarantees you don't get the sort of people who can rise above it. And I wouldn't say it categorically, but it doesn't make me think that we're going to transcend our shortage of talent too easily.